Greetings! Some of you are about to, or may be, celebrating the festival of Hanukkah. So happy Hanukkah to those who are celebrating it. Chag Hanukkah Sameach. I have given some sermons giving the background to the festival. One of them was called a Hanukkah homily and available on our CCK 153 channel. Another one was given at the Church of the Sovereign God, which was called Fear Not, Little Flock, along those lines, or Fear Ye Not, Little Flock, a lesson from the Feast of Dedication. Fear Ye Not, Little Flock, a lesson from the Feast of Dedication, something along those lines. And it's available on audio, I think, now on the website of the Church of the Sovereign God. It will be available soon, if not even as I speak, as in an audio form. And God willing, I do plan on the Sabbath during the festival of Hanukkah to talk about more of the New Testament significance to it. And in fact, today I'm going to talk about both the New Testament and the Old Testament and how they conjoin, how they blend together, how one transitions into the other. We have the Hebrew and the Aramaic scriptures. We have the Greek scriptures. The Jewish community has the responsibility to preserve the Old Testament canon, as it's called in modern parlance. And the Greek-speaking community has the responsibility to preserve the New Testament canon. And of course, those communities have done that job under God's guidance over the centuries. Today, I want to talk about two testimonies to the truth. Two testimonies to the truth. I want to talk about the end of the Old Testament scriptures, as it were, the Old Testament canon, and the beginning of the New Testament scriptures. And remember that Jesus Christ is at the center of all of them. He is the tie that binds, as it were, the collections of Holy Writ as they come together, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. I want to go to Ephesians, the second chapter. Ephesians, the second chapter. Hanukkah, as you know, is the festival of the rededication of the temple and of the miraculous victory which led to that rededication, the miraculous victory of the Maccabees. You might say it was the purpose of the Maccabees to make Judea great again. Where have I heard that? Anyway, I want to go to Ephesians 2, and I want to go to verse 20. We are compared to a temple. The festival of Hanukkah is a festival of the dedication of the temple. And the temple is a type of God's church, among other things. We are a antitype of that temple. And in Ephesians 2 and verse 20, it says, "Now to him who is able to do abundantly," I'm sorry, that's a wonderful scripture, but I want to go to the second chapter. That was in the third. Let's go to Ephesians 2 and verse 20. We are as a temple, compared to a temple, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, to whom the whole building being fitted together grows into a holy temple to the Lord. So we are a temple to the Lord. Excuse me, and the chief cornerstone is Jesus Christ. And directly or under the direction of prophets, Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures were written. And directly or under the supervision of apostles, Greek scriptures were written. And these have become part of the sacred canon, the Holy Scriptures, the Bible. I want to give now some highlights from the conclusion of the Old Testament as preserved by the Hebrew-speaking world. There is a general consensus on the order of the books of the Tanakh, the law, the prophets, and the writings, or as some people call them, the Hagiographa, the holy writings. There is a consensus in the Hebrew-speaking world on the order of those books, the tripartite division of the Old Testament scriptures into law, prophets, and writings. And the final books are put together at First and Second Chronicles. They're counted as one book, but they're First and Second Chronicles. They are a summary and a conclusion of the Old Testament and very critical in terms of where they're placed. I want to go to Luke 24 and verse 44, talking about the tripartite division of the scriptures. We read in the book of Luke, Jesus Christ speaking of the books of the Bible that prophesied about him. And in Luke 24 and verse 44, Jesus says, as quoted by Luke, "And he said to them, These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses, and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." The law, the prophets, and then the third section of the Bible begins with and is very heavily, a very significant portion of that third section is the Psalms, and they begin that third section. In most collections, most Hebrew collections have it that way, and that's the general consensus today. If you buy a Hebrew Bible today, the third section will begin with Psalms. I want to go to Matthew 24 and 23 and verse 45. Verse 34. Matthew 23 and verse 34. And it's really sad how God's people over the years have been persecuted, for telling the truth. In other words, if you don't like the message, slay the messenger. That's been the case. And Jesus Christ brought it to a head in his ministry. A generation later, it was all going to come crashing down on those people. That's very sad. But a generation later, everything came to a head. As you know, the temple was destroyed and the people exiled, many of the people exiled. But in Matthew 23 and verse 34, Jesus says, "Therefore indeed I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify." So even in the future, martyrdom, as you know, Stephen was martyred, Paul was nearly martyred, Jesus Christ himself was martyred, but of course resurrected. I'm going to read again. "Therefore indeed I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth." I'm in verse 35. "From the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." And within about 40 years, of course, that happened. So he goes and so he speaks about the martyrdom of Abel in the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, and then all the way we come now to the martyrdom of a prophet, Zechariah, which is at the end of the Bible, which is in 2 Chronicles 24. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 24. And as I said, if you had a Hebrew Bible, it would be the last book of the Old Testament. 2 Chronicles 24. By the way, when you read that passage, it's fascinating in the English. It's an interesting coincidence. It's like everything from A to Z, from Abel to Zechariah. It's interesting how that works out, how hideously it works out. The first person to be martyred in English is Abel, and the last one mentioned is a man named Zechariah, beginning with a Z. Of course, in Hebrew, it's not that way. It's a chet and a zion. But anyway, I want to go to 2 Chronicles 24, and I want to talk about Joash, who began positively, verse 2. This is 2 Chronicles 24, 2. Joash, I'm going to be covering highlights from this book of Chronicles as it finishes the Old Testament and leads us to the New. Even though there were 4 centuries in between, as the material was being written. 2 Chronicles 24, verse 2. "Joash did what was right in the sight of the Eternal all the days of Jehoiada the priest." Oh, well, the priest had a positive influence on him, but he lived a long time too, but he eventually died, as we all do and will. But in 2 Chronicles 24 and verse 17, "Now after the death of Jehoiada," this is 2 Chronicles 24:17, "the leaders of Judah came and bowed down to the king, and the king listened to them." "Therefore they left the house of the eternal God of their fathers and served wooden images and idols, and wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem because of their trespass. Yet he sent prophets to them to bring them back to the eternal, and they testified against them, but they would not listen. Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah the son of Jehoiada." Now, was he literally his son? Sometimes the word son is used loosely and can mean a grandson. And so perhaps he was a grandson. Perhaps his father was named Berechiah. And he is the Zechariah, son of Berechiah, that Jesus is referring to. And if that's true, you could understand why in later times there was a later prophet whose name was Zechariah, and his father was named Berechiah. You can find that in Zechariah 1. And if that's the case, then perhaps that later Berechiah, knowing that there had been a Zechariah in earlier years, the son of a Berechiah, maybe went ahead and did the same. I'm Berechiah, I'll name my son Zechariah. It's possible. And in other verses, Zechariah is spoken of as the son of Iddo, and again, in that case, he may have been a grandson of Iddo. You find references to that in the book of Ezra, I believe, or Nehemiah, or both, he's called the son of Iddo, but he may have been a grandson of Iddo. So I'm saying that this Zechariah in Matthew 24:35 is very likely this Zechariah here, who's called here the son of Jehoiada. Now, there are other views on that subject, but in any case, it does tend to tie in with the fact that if you're reading the Old Testament the way the Jews read it, you begin with Genesis and you end with 2 Chronicles. It is supportive of that. So I want to read what happened here. Verse 19, yet he sent prophets to them to bring them back to the Eternal, and they testified against them, but they would not listen. And by the way, another option is the fact that Jehoiada may have had that other name of Berechiah. I have two names. I am Meir David, or in English, Mark David. And there are people who go by different names at times. So that's another possibility there. Anyway, verse 19, yet he sent prophets to them to bring them back to the Eternal, and they testified against them, but they would not listen. Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, who stood above the people, and said to them, thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Eternal, so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Eternal, he also has forsaken you. Verse 21, so they conspired against him, and at the command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Eternal. And I think this is what Jesus is referring to there. It's possible. I know that there are other options. It's worth knowing this, though, because it is sad that as the Old Testament period, as the Old Testament history is summarized, we have this martyrdom, talked about here, and it is very tragic. But it's been the case through history many times that righteous people are martyred. Martyrdom is a part of, unfortunately, the heritage of the heritage of the church is martyrdom. And there will yet be martyrdom in the future, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. There will yet be martyrdom in the future, but there also will be ultimately victory in the future. And, of course, that's what Hanukkah talks about, too, martyrdom and victory. Verse 21, so they conspired against him, and at the command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Eternal. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but killed his son. And as he died, he said, the Eternal look on it and repay. So there are times when that is an appropriate thought. I want to talk now about more of the positive elements of the book of 2 Chronicles. We see here some of the sordid side of Judah's history. But I want to go now to some of the positive. The book of Chronicles focuses on Jerusalem as where God is working. It's important. It focuses on the house of Judah where God was working, which is also very important. People needed to know that the Samaritans were not, spiritually speaking, where people needed to look for leadership. It wasn't Mount Gerizim and the Samaritan temple there, but rather it was Jerusalem and the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and it was rather to the house of Judah, to the priesthood of the Aaronic priesthood and the Levitical priesthood and the monarchy of David. That is where the scriptures were being compiled. That is where whatever remnant were keeping the covenant, that is where they could be found, in that community. And it was very important at the end of the Old Testament period to focus on that, because Jesus Christ was going to come as a descendant of David. He was going to come to the temple in Jerusalem, and he would also eventually, in effect, I'm trying to think of the right word, assume the responsibilities, maybe ultimately, of the priests and Levites. He would be the priest, the Melchizedek priest that the book of Hebrews talks about. But all of that, a background to all of that, is the fact of these books of Chronicles. They lay the stage, they set the stage for that. I want to go to 2 Chronicles 7 and around verse 12. Here we have the dedication of Solomon's temple, and so we go back to that period. And in 2 Chronicles 7 and verse 12, then the Eternal appeared to Solomon by night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When now unfortunately though, as we see, people often get involved in behavior that is so self-destructive that God intervenes to punish them, to get them back on the right track. So we see in verse 13, he says, when I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people. Verse 14, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. Very important scripture, and in fact, it is one that is popular, that is well known, that has been put to music, and many of you know this verse, and I could talk a lot about this verse and the impact it's had on me personally, but I won't today. But let me just read it again, 2 Chronicles 7:14. I read it to you in context, but it certainly can be applied in many, many situations. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. We do have an application that comes up later in this book, and that's in 2 Chronicles 20. So as we go later on, we come to the time of Jehoshaphat, and the temple was standing, and there was a Davidic monarch, and there were Levitical priests, and the Levites serving in the temple, and the Aaronic priesthood, the ancestors of the speaker today. And I go to 2 Chronicles 20, and let's see what happened there. It happened after this that the people of Moab with the people of Ammon and others with them besides the Ammonites came to battle against Jehoshaphat. So, the Middle East seems to have the same recurring cycles. The Jews are there trying to maintain their nation, and various ones around have other ideas, hostility. Then some came and told Jehoshaphat, saying, a great multitude is coming against you from beyond the sea, from Syria, and there in Hazazon Tamar, which is in En Gedi. Then Jehoshaphat feared. So they were pretty close to where he was. That area is not such a big area, if any of you have been there or looked at a map. And Jehoshaphat feared and set himself to seek the Eternal and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. So right away he acted. This chapter had a big impact on me too, but I won't tell that story today. But I want you to also read this chapter, and I hope and pray that it will impact your lives too. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 4. So Judah gathered together to ask help from the Eternal, and from all the cedars of Judah they came to seek the Eternal. YHWH, Yud-He, Vav-He, Yahweh, which is normally Adonai, or if you're speaking conversationally, Jews will say Hashem. And the Moffat translation, I believe, which was very popular at one time, translates the Eternal, and also I believe the French Bible translates it the Eternal, trying to go back to the original meaning of the name as the self-existent one, Hoveh Hayah V'Yeh, he is, he was, he will be. Then Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah in Jerusalem in the house of the Eternal before the new court and said, O Eternal God of our fathers, are you not God in heaven, and so do you not rule over all the kingdoms of the nations? And in your hand is there not power and might, so that no one is able to withstand you? And are you not our God, who drove out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and gave it to the descendants of Abraham, your friend, forever? Abraham was God's friend. You find that also in Isaiah, and you find it in James, I believe. And they dwell in it, and you have built you a sanctuary in it for your name, saying, if disaster comes upon us, sword, judgment, pestilence, or famine, we will stand before this temple and in your presence, for your name is in this temple, and cry out to you in our affliction, and you will hear and save. This is going back to how Solomon prayed when the temple was dedicated. And now here are the people of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, whom you would not let Israel invade, the Edomites. Mount Seir people were the Edomites. and you can go back and read about that, whom you would not let Israel invade when they came out of the land of Egypt, but they turned from them and did not destroy them. Here they are rewarding us by coming to throw us out of your possession, which you have given us to inherit. We did not devastate them as we moved in to our inheritance, but now they're coming against us. O our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power against this great multitude that is coming against us, nor do we know what to do, but our eyes are upon you. So in this situation, Judah couldn't just, kind of get out of it on their own. They really had their backs to the wall and had no choice but to seek God's help. And that's the way it's going to be before the second coming of Christ. The Jews are going to have their backs against the wall and will cry out to God. And this time, of course, they will be saved by the Messiah, and he will also reveal himself as Jesus Christ, the Savior. They're going to have this reconciliation. You can read about it in Zechariah 12. Anyway, verse 13. Now all Judah and also Zechariah 14 for that matter. Now verse 13. And all Judah with their little ones, their wives and their children stood before the Eternal. So the whole community was in an attitude of prayer, and Jehoshaphat prayed on behalf of the people. Many of them were fasting, as it says. Then the Spirit of the Eternal came upon Jahaziel, the son of Zechariah. So here's another Zechariah, and he has a son who's in this case the prophet. Jahaziel is the prophet, son of Zechariah, the son of Benaiah, the son of Jeiel, the son of Mattaniah, a Levite of the sons of Asaph. Okay, so he was among the Levites, and they had various roles to perform. They were musicians, they were teachers. They helped with the sacrificial system. They were the ministry of that time. A Levite of the sons of Asaph in the midst of the assembly. And he said, this is in verse 15, listen, all you of Judah and you inhabitants of Jerusalem, and you, King Jehoshaphat. Thus says the Eternal to you, do not be afraid, nor dismayed because of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours but God's. So he told them, yes, you're way outnumbered, but you're going to win. And this victory was even greater than what the Maccabees achieved in later years, because they had to fight, and God gave them the victory. In this case, all Judah had to do was show up, and God intervened totally, where all they had to do was show up and watch the enemy destroy themselves. Verse 16, tomorrow go down against them. They will surely come to you by the ascent of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the brook before the wilderness of Jeruel. You will not need to fight in this battle. Position yourselves, stand still, and see the salvation of the Eternal. It's like the Red Sea crossing. All Israel had to do, of course, they had to have the faith to walk into the sea. The sea split, they walked across. They had to have faith, of course, to follow Moses, and the leadership across the sea. But God did the battling for them. They had to exercise the faith. Now that's the situation here too. Judah had to exercise faith. They had to show up. They had to be there facing that other army. They had their role to play, but they didn't have to take any violent action, because once they showed up, God did the rest. You will not need to fight in this battle. Position yourselves, stand still, and see the salvation of the Eternal who is with you, O Judah and Jerusalem. Do not fear or be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, for the Eternal is with you. And Jehoshaphat bowed his head with his face to the ground, and all Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem bowed before the Eternal, worshiping the Eternal. Then the Levites of the children of the Kohathites and of the children of the Korites stood up to praise the Eternal, God of Israel, with voices loud and high. So after this message, they were inspired, and in faith they sang. They praised the Eternal. So they rose early in the morning and went out into the wilderness of Tekoa. And as they went out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, hear me, O Judah, and you inhabitants of Jerusalem. He must have had to shout it out. They didn't have, microphones in those days, PA systems. Hear me, O Judah, and you inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you shall be established. Believe his prophets, and you shall prosper. And when he had consulted with the people, he appointed those who should sing to the Eternal and who should praise the beauty of holiness as they went out before the army, and were saying, praise the Eternal, for his mercy endures forever. And you know the Psalms, or should. Verse 22, now when they began to sing and to praise, the Eternal set ambushes against the people of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, who had come against Judah, and they were defeated. I can't help but think about one episode that I was involved in personally. Some of you may recall this, even if you're older people. We were in a situation, we were occupying our own building. It wasn't anybody else's building, but belonged to the Church of God. And we were occupying our building to keep the government from, in effect, taking over the church unconstitutionally. In America, that is illegal. And yet the state of California at one time attempted to do that. Well, the police were about to come. But I remember we gathered together in the building and we sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers," and the police never showed up. So those of you who were there know we didn't have to go to jail after all, and the whole situation eventually was rectified. So I was in the middle of that. Anyway, let's go to verse 23. For the people of Ammon and Moab stood up against the inhabitants of Mount Seir to utterly kill and destroy them. And when they had made an end of the inhabitants of Seir, they helped to destroy one another. Isn't that interesting? These were people who really, they were together for convenience, but they had rivalries one with another. I was just watching a brilliant lecture. One of the most brilliant professors out there now is Victor Davis Hanson. So if any of you want to look up any of the stuff that he's lectured or written, but he had something on World War II, and he showed how the Axis powers were, they didn't trust one another. So the Japanese had their agenda, the Germans had, particularly, and the Germans had their agenda, particularly those two, and they didn't really trust one another. So in a sense, their lack of coordination was a very big detriment to them. In other words, evil is self-destructive. That's what one of the things that destroyed the Axis was the fact that they were, as I said, they didn't trust each other. Anyway, verse 23, for the people of Ammon and Moab stood up against the inhabitants of Mount Seir to utterly kill and destroy them. And when they had made an end of the inhabitants of Seir, they helped to destroy one another. So when Judah came to a place overlooking the wilderness, they looked toward the multitude, and there were their dead bodies fallen on the earth. No one had escaped. Isn't that interesting? They had just slaughtered each other. They'd gone wild. And you see what's going on in the Middle East today. People go wild. They suicide bombings and all this kind of thing. Verse 25, when Jehoshaphat and his people came to take away their spoil, they found among them an abundance of valuables on the dead bodies and precious jewelry which they stripped off for themselves, more than they could carry away. And they were 3 days gathering the spoil because there was so much. So this was kind of a multiple accomplishment. See, not only did God punish evil nations, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, but also he gave his people great wealth as a result. So it was a 2-for-1 kind, at least more than that. He also taught the people a tremendous lesson in faith. So a lot of blessings came from this. Now, obviously, the bereaved families in those 3 countries didn't look at it that way, but they should have learned a lesson. And from the Jewish point of view, from the church point of view, it was a baracha, a blessing. And so that's what they called the valley. And on the 4th day, they assembled in the valley of baracha, blessing. For there they blessed the Eternal. Therefore, the name of the place was called the valley of baracha, the valley of blessing, until this day. What do they say in English? Baracha? I'm kidding, but I suppose that's what some people call it, the valley of baracha. But in Hebrew, it's baracha. Okay, verse 27. Then they returned, every man of Judah and Jerusalem, with Jehoshaphat in front of them, to go back to Jerusalem with joy, for the Eternal had made them rejoice over their enemies. I'll read another couple of verses. So they came to Jerusalem with stringed instruments and harps and trumpets to the house of the Eternal. And the fear of God was on all the kingdoms of those countries when they heard that the Eternal had fought against the enemies of Israel. So another thing it accomplished was peace for that nation for quite some time. The lesson was learned. Leave them alone. Don't, like we have this bumper sticker in America, don't mess with Texas. So back then, if the chariots had bumper stickers, it might be don't mess with Judah. Verse 30. Then the realm of Jehoshaphat was quiet, for his God gave him rest all around. Now, what we gain from this is 2 Chronicles 20:20. I remember an evangelist giving this talk years ago, and I'm going to continue that tradition of 2020 vision. Now, I meant to look it up. I don't know I know that in America, and possibly also in Canada, and I'm not sure where else, but in America and Canada, if your vision is normal, maybe it's even possibly changed in Canada now, but at least in the 50 states, in the United States and perhaps our territories, if your vision is normal, they say you have 20/20 vision. If your vision is normal, you have 20/20 vision. And spiritually speaking, if your vision is normal spiritually, you have 20/20 vision. 2 Chronicles 20:20. Let's take a look again. So they rose early in the morning and went out into the wilderness of Tekoa. And as they went out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, "Hear me, O Judah, and you inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the eternal your God, and you shall be established. Believe his prophets, and you shall prosper." 20/20 vision, spiritually speaking. Believe in the eternal your God, and you shall be established. Believe his prophets, and you shall prosper. Now let's go to the end of 2 Chronicles. And sad to say, they did not believe God's prophets towards the end of the Old Testament period, as we know, or towards the end of this section here. They did not believe God's prophets, and they were punished and exiled. And so I'm going to pick up the account in verse 19. I would like to read more, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to go to the end of 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 19. And this talks about the punishment under Nebuchadnezzar, the siege, the captivity, the exile, the Babylonian exile, which concludes this book, but not totally, because we'll see that there is a positive conclusion finally. But let's see what happened here, because they rejected 2 Chronicles 20:20. In verse 19 of 2 Chronicles 36, then they burned the house of God, the Chaldean armies. Then they burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons, until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. Oh, a new kingdom came, the Medo-Persian Empire. It conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the empire of the Chaldeans, and it permitted the Jews to return. And so we have a type of Jesus Christ here. We have Cyrus, who is called a shepherd in the book of Isaiah, and Jesus Christ is the great shepherd. But Cyrus is a shepherd, and Cyrus conquered Babylon, as Jesus Christ will conquer the end-time Babylon, and he sent the Jews back to Judea to rebuild their city and their temple, as Jesus Christ will restore the Jews when he returns. So Cyrus is a type of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the antitype. And as we come to verse 21, the Jews were punished at that time, in verse 21, to fulfill the word of the Eternal by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. The land was supposed to rest every 7th year. And evidently, many sabbatical cycles had gone by where the majority of the land was not resting. And so there were 70 straight years when it did rest to make up for that. To fulfill the word of the Eternal by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Eternal by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. So we talked about 70 years. Well, so the 70 years ended and the exile ended. Now, it was only a partial restoration. You know when the full restoration will be? At the second coming of Jesus Christ, and not before. But this was a partial restoration, so it was a type of the millennium. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Eternal by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Eternal stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, also put it in writing, saying. Now, before I read what he said, this is a more condensed version of what he said to end the book of 2 Chronicles. I want to show you how Chronicles ties in with Matthew. Matthew is the first book of the New Testament. I want to go to 1 Chronicles. If you can do this, put a hand on 1 Chronicles, and then put your other hand on Matthew. Now, if you're extraterrestrial, maybe you'll have a third hand with which you could take notes. Most of us don't have that. We're human. So what can you do? Just listen, I guess. Take the notes later. All right, let's go to 1 Chronicles and notice how it begins. And notice that, and as I said, the Jews count this as one long book. Divrei Hayamim Aleph, Divrei Hayamim Bet. Let's take a look at Divrei Hayamim Aleph. This is the first page of the first book of Chronicles. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech. Oh, so we begin with a genealogy of the human race, and then you'll see very early it focuses on the family of David. I told you that's important in Chronicles, the focus on the family of David, and talks about Judah, talks about Israel, talks about David, talks about Judah, and then some of the other tribes are there. And particularly there's a focus, as I said, on the Levitical family. You understand the focus of Chronicles is on the Davidic monarchy and the Levitical priesthood. But so it does begin with genealogies that do point the way to Jesus Christ. Now, how does Matthew begin? Look at Matthew now, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and again there's a genealogy here. So Matthew, just as Chronicles begins with the genealogy pointing to the Davidic monarchy, so does the book of Matthew begin with the genealogy pointing to the Davidic monarchy and ultimately pointing to Jesus Christ. That's how it starts, because Jesus Christ, as I said, is at the center of both testaments. He's at the center of the Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures. He's at the center of the Greek scriptures. All right, now let's see how 2 Chronicles ends, because if you're reading the Bible as a Jewish believer might read it, you would read 2 Chronicles and then go on to Matthew. So let's read the Bible as I said, as a perhaps Nazarene in the first century might have read it. Here we go. We're at the end of the Old Testament, and here's what it says. This is 2 Chronicles 36:23. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the eternal God of heaven has given me. And he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May the eternal his God be with him and let him go up. Let me read that final statement. Who is among you of all his people? May the eternal his God be with him and let him go up. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. See how that ties in so well? Ties in beautifully. So 2 Chronicles ends, and then we go to Matthew, and it all ties together. Because Jesus Christ, in fact, is at the center of the Bible, both the Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures and the Greek scriptures. In conclusion, I would like to go to 2 Chronicles 20 again, in verse 20, although that's like a, what do you call that? What do you call that? Pre-climax, anti-climax? I'm not exactly at the climax, but I'm close. 2 Chronicles 20 and verse 20. So they rose early in the morning and went out into the wilderness of Tekoa. And as they went out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, Hear me, O Judah, and you inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the eternal your God, and you shall be established. Believe his prophets, and you shall prosper. In other words, Matthew 6:33. That's where I'm going now. Matthew 6 and verse 33. Yes, we have material needs, and you know what Jesus said about them in Matthew 6:33. They're important, but the most important, of course, is what is spiritual. It's our opportunity, which is beyond price, beyond value. Our inestimably precious opportunity to be children of God forever. So let's go to Matthew 6:33. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. 2 testimonies to the truth. Well, I hope this has provoked you or encouraged you to study these verses and what's around them, the context. And we again hope that those of you who are celebrating Hanukkah can have a safe and spiritually profitable one. And we hope all of you at this time of the year can be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. And we ask, of course, God's blessing on those of you who are viewing this, that it would be helpful to all of you who are viewing this. All the best to you and yours.